Good afternoon and welcome to Open Classroom. I'm Janet Gillow, the Director of Professional Development for the Brown School, Washington University in St. Louis. So happy to have you as part of the group today for a really important program. For those of you joining us on Zoom, you probably know the deal with webinars by now that we can't see or hear you and we can't call on raised hands, but the chat feature is enabled and we really do want your questions and comments. We're going to have a poll for you, so please do jump into the conversation. We'll also want to welcome folks joining us on YouTube. Real glad to have you here. And we're also not able to moderate any kind of chat through YouTube at this time. So next I'm going to introduce my friend and colleague and co-host, and this is a particularly significant time to introduce her because she's got a new title. She just got promoted and I'm so proud of her and so happy. Please welcome the Brown School's new communications director, Tiffany Phillips, who's going to help moderate and share something about what's coming up on Open Classroom.
Sure. Janet, thank you so much. I so appreciate you as a colleague and a friend. Thanks for the shout out. I do want to mention a few upcoming events that you guys could mark your calendars for. On the 17th of this month, we have Dr. Karen Jakuti. She's a featured speaker for our Open Classroom session titled A Radiologist in the Warm Heart of Africa, Wins, Challenges, and Aspirations. And that's presented in partnership with the Africa Initiative. And on the 24th, you can join Beth Brawley from Life Without Anxiety for a timely talk on vaccine hesitancy titled Fear of Needles and the Unknown, Compassionately Addressing Vaccine Avoidance. And finally, we invite you to our yearly Brown School Convocation featuring Dr. Leo J. Kabasa. He earned this year's Distinguished Faculty Award. He's an amazing scholar, and his presentation will focus on reducing health inequities in people with serious mental illness, and they will have time for Q&A in that session. Now I'll hand it back to you, Janet.
Great. So a really important and timely topic today. And when Marissa and I first started talking about doing this program, I credit her with knowing when things were going to get wild. And so our timing couldn't have been better. And all the credit goes to Marissa, but just to share a little bit about our speakers before turning the program over to them. They're both employees of the Metropolitan St. Equal Housing and Opportunity Council. And that organization seeks to ensure access to housing and places of public accommodations for all people. And they do that through education, counseling, investigation, and enforcement. And so we're joined today by two of their best and brightest, who also happen to be Washington University alums and native St. Louisans. So we've got Marissa Cohen, who's the education coordinator and an alum of the Brown School's Master of Social Work program. She's also a presenter in our professional development workshop series. And we're joined by Lauren Verseman, who represents clients with fair housing complaints and other legal issues as a staff attorney. And she's an alum of our law school. So without further ado, turning it over to our colleagues for our program, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
I will go ahead and share my screen as we begin. So again, let's see. Let me make sure that there we go. Alrighty, so again, thank you so much to WashU for inviting EHOC to come and talk about this very important topic. Like you said, Janet, it was such a toss-up. This whole year has been a toss-up in terms of where we will stand as it relates to eviction moratoriums and housing instability. So I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Marissa Cohen. As Janet stated, I am the education coordinator with EHOC, and this is my colleague, Lauren.
I am Lauren Verseman. I'm a staff attorney with EHOC. So that means I work on a variety of fair housing matters, disability related, different kinds of discrimination with protected classes. But I also find that I do a lot of eviction work in conjunction with that, which is something that we're going to be talking about later on.
Yes, thank you so much, Lauren. And so before we get started, I do, adapting to this virtual space and this webinar format, especially where we cannot see who's on the other end of our presentation, we'd love, if you do not mind, just taking a moment to introduce yourself and to complete our poll. So share your pronouns, your organizational affiliation, if any, as well as your name. And you can share that with everyone. or with the hosts and panelists, and we'll be able to see your responses. Cool. Thank you so much for launching the poll. Awesome, from Columbia, Missouri. Glad to have you. All righty. So we'll just take just a couple of more minutes just to give you all a chance to answer the poll question. There are two questions on here. One, just to understand the familiarity with the eviction process. How familiar are you with the eviction process and with the fair housing laws? Awesome, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you all so much for introducing yourself. It's great to know who's on the other side of the chat. Awesome, from Massachusetts, wow. Alrighty, we look forward to connecting with you all. If you haven't had a chance, go ahead and complete the poll for us. We'll just close it in 1 more minute. This just helps us to have an understanding of who we're speaking with and some of the information that you'll gain today, especially surrounding the eviction process, you may find valuable. And so we'd like to know kind of what's our starting point.
So I've closed the poll and you should be able to see results now.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so it looks like we have a nice spread for the most part. Lauren, are you able to see the results as well?
I am. I love how we're all reluctant to say we know more than a little bit about anything. So that's always a star category.
Yes, awesome. Thank you. All righty. So with that being said, I think you've already shared the results with everyone. So thank you, Janet, for your assistance with that. Now we'll go into the presentation a little bit, and I will not be able to see the chat during the presentation. So Lauren, if you could help me out with that part, if we have anything to address, and I'll do the same when you're speaking. So just to start us off, I want to say thank you again. EHOC completed the Stopgap report on June 9th of 2021. So it was during a time where there was still a lot of uncertainty around the eviction moratoria and whether they would continue. Many times during the creation of this report, there were changes, new information, and the landscape has changed continually, as is the case for today. So the pandemic, as we know, has caused major economic disruption in many ways, and one in which is in housing. Because of the pandemic, an already challenged housing landscape in terms of affordability has now become even more inaccessible due to an onslaught of eviction filings. For many, the result of the eviction crisis will limit the opportunity to obtain quality, affordable housing. In this report, we learn a disproportionate number of people who belong within protected classes, federally protected classes from the Fair Housing Act. They have been impacted especially, and for that reason, we say that the eviction crisis is a fair housing crisis. The purpose of this report is to highlight the problem and to call for legislative and advocacy changes to end discriminatory housing practices. So as you see, we will discuss the multi-step process of evictions, the eviction moratoriums and the eviction filings, where evictions have taken place, as well as the fair housing impact of the eviction crisis. So to start us off, I will pass it to Lauren to talk to you all about the multi-step process of evictions.
So part of the reason we include this, what seems like maybe a granular or not that important thing to understand about evictions, is that when we talk about the moratoriums, we can't understand them without understanding all of these different pieces of what has to happen for an eviction to happen. So there's a distinct legal process for multiple kinds of evictions, for rent that's overdue or for other kinds of lease violations or staying after your lease is up. Your landlord's not allowed, does it happen? Yes, but your landlord is not allowed to just change your locks or take your door off and throw you out. There's a court process. So it's a multi-step process. And before an eviction's filed, something's happening. Your late on your rent, maybe your lease was up at the end of June, but you couldn't find anywhere else. And so you decided to just stay and hope that you could do a month to month, and your landlord's like, nope. So you might end up with a different kind of eviction case that way. So something's going on, and your landlords are going to give you a notice to quit or some kind of letter with a lease violation, something from the landlord themselves or something that somebody property management has written up. There's no case yet. You haven't been evicted yet, but a lot of people perceive that as, what an eviction is. So the landlord gave me an eviction, but that's just the very, very beginning. The landlord then has to hire an attorney. If it's an LLC or some other kind of business entity, they must hire an attorney. If it's an individual who owns a few properties, they can file a lawsuit by themselves without an attorney. They can be rent in possession, which is just past rent, and then unlawful detainer, which is kind of that whole other bucket of lease violations and things like that. So these two main kinds of evictions. And there's also this other class of emergency evictions, which are for maybe major property damage or some kind of really explicit criminal activity, some things that can be considered an emergency damage to the property. Those are supposed to be used as emergencies. Again, sometimes that tool can be used to try to get around the other process, but that's a much, much smaller amount of the filings. But when you see the administrative orders that come out of the city, you'll understand which kind is important. So after that filing, people are going to get a court date. They're going to have one or more appearances. That first appearance, you can get a continuance, or it might be your trial date if nobody has an attorney. This can end in settlement, so you can work something out, just a deal. I'll pay this back by this time, and we stay or we dismiss. It can go to mediation, which is a more formal third-party mediation where you work out a deal, but with somebody else there facilitating. Or you could go to a trial in front of the judge. Even an individual without an attorney can bring an eviction case to trial and submit evidence and speak on their behalf to the judge. And so a lot of times that folks who show up without an attorney will be expected to perform, to have their trial right on the spot, but there is a right to ask for a continuance to prepare, but many people don't know that. So that's the court process. It can go quick, or it could if you get attorneys on both sides and start requesting documents and different kinds of evidence, it could go on for months. At the end of that whole court process, that's when a judgment finally happens. So that's where the judge makes a decision about who won and what's going to happen, or when the parties agree about what the judgment should be. So the first one is a consent judgment. That's an agreement. That's where both parties sign off and say, okay, yes, I owed money. Okay, yes, you can stay as long as you pay it. Consent. There's default judgment, which means the tenant didn't show up for court. It can also mean the landlord didn't show up for court, but that is much, much more rare. But if one doesn't show up for court, then the judgment is automatically issued in favor of the landlord. And then the trial is the other way you can get a judgment. So that's the decision. That's when the case has been decided. Damages, like extra past rent due, fees, attorney's fees, things like that are all decided then. After that, the judgment becomes final after 10 days in a rent in possession, and then there's the execution. The execution is the part where the sheriff actually comes with the piece of paper and says, we're going to be locking you out of this apartment, or your stuff needs to come out. We're coming in 6 days, or we're coming in 2 days to actually physically evict you. So that's the other thing that people think about as what is an actual eviction. So it's either the first piece where a letter happened and now I've been evicted, or the last piece, which is I've been physically evicted. But this entire process is the eviction multi-step process. And so figuring out where you are, and it can be very difficult for folks, especially who aren't accustomed to looking things up on CaseNet, who don't know how to navigate the court system, who don't know that a summons isn't the same as a judgment. And so there's a lot of confusion about where you are and what you're supposed to do, and there's also confusion about when we start talking about the moratoriums, what's on hold, what is stopped. And so if we look at the next slide about the eviction landscape, we have these previous moratoriums that have stopped some piece of this eviction process that we just talked about. There was originally, and I'm looking at these dates, hard to even wrap my mind around March 27th, 2020 at this point, that this is how long we've been going through these things, but here we are, March 27th, 2020, there was a 120-day moratorium on evictions for like covered properties. So properties that had some kind of federal funding. So you'll see that in subsidized, LIHTC, some of those kinds of developments. And then that went through July, and then there was a gap for a moment. And then in September of 2020 came the CDC moratorium, which is the one I think at this point we're all the most familiar with, because it's been cycling, expiring and getting renewed at the last minute for some time now. Actually almost a year if we really. So that started on September 4th. Of last year. There were legal challenges in the courts about whether there was even authority to do this. Could the CDC put a hold on the moratorium or do a moratorium on evictions, which is explicitly something that happens under state law. So evictions are Missouri, like what I just talked about is the process, that's a Missouri process. And it isn't exactly the same in every state. And some states have more tenant protections or some other kinds of timing issues and all of that. So the folks who are out there in Texas or in New York or Maryland, like you're gonna have a different set of rules, but you're gonna still have a process. So essentially it stood up to all of the challenges basically over the course of its life through the summer. So it was supposed to it was set to expire July 31st, and then it did briefly. And then here we come again with another renewal that's going through. Actually, it says October 1st, but it's October 3rd on there. And so this was a wild ride because it was initially through, I'm trying to remember, initially through December 31st of 2020. And then it got extended, and it got extended again, and then it got extended again at the very last minute. And the same thing is true of the next page, which is our local moratoriums. The city and the county had their own versions of local moratoriums that before the CDC moratorium, and then they had their own versions of trying to implement the CDC moratorium as well. So the city had several extensions to its moratoriums. The court was completely closed there for a while at the beginning, so there were no filings, and then the courts reopened. Filings resumed. There were different requirements for the that CARES Act moratorium we talked about, saying like this isn't, subsidized property. This doesn't apply. So there are all kinds of different procedural things the courts have done to try to make that work. And if you're local, you're aware that the city and the county of St. Louis are in different judicial circuits. So they have different presiding judges, which means they have different sets of rules about how the court and the sheriff are going to carry out these processes. So even though we're the same metropolitan area, they could have completely different ways of interpreting things. And you've seen that the county has attached its moratoriums to this idea of a phased opening. So how bad is COVID? is the kind of low level question. If it's extra bad, then we're in phase 1 or phase 0. If no one in the courthouse has tested positive for a while and cases in St. Louis County are going down, then we might move on to 2. And once we've moved on to 2, then evictions can resume. And that was a weekly question mark. So not even a monthly question mark like some of the CDC things, but every week we'd look for an order like, what phase are we going to? What's the word on the phase? And so there's just, when we talk about instability, there's instability built into the rules themselves of like, what's going to happen. And then most recently, once some of our more generous moratoriums expired, we still had both courts trying to implement the CDC moratorium to some degree. So just August 6th, which was just a couple of days ago, Judge Stelzer in the city said that the CDC moratorium applies in the city through October 3rd when it was set to expire. So that means that if people do the process of filing a paper that says, I've tried to get rental assistance, I've paid the rent to the best of my ability, but I can't pay it, that's listed in the CDC moratorium, that those folks, even if there's a judgment, they're not going to get evicted from their house. That doesn't apply to all of us over here with the lease violations or expired leases or any of those other things, but it does apply to the rent. And the county is still figuring out exactly what it's going to do to try to comply with the CDC moratorium. But so far, the sheriff's office has been working, and this county council had legislation to try to adhere to the CDC guidelines. So we're right now in a situation where both the city and the county are trying to comply with the CDC moratorium, but that CDC moratorium itself is precarious because it's open to legal challenges, which are pending. Landlords have filed challenges to that a few times, and many recently, and many commentators in the legal arena say like this time it's got a pretty good chance of losing. So there's a question mark. And I know we come to these webinars a lot of times, right, to get an answer, but to some degree you're going to get a question mark, because that is what we've all been working with. Is part of the reason you might be confused is that it's shifting, it's constantly shifting. And just on a personal note, right, that's hard as a practitioner, but it's extremely hard on my clients as well, who are trying to figure out what the rules are and don't know from this week to the next week what's going to happen. So it's the landscape is tough.
Yes, definitely. And to that point, we did want to point out a few of the challenges with the number of eviction moratoria that have taken place over this time. Someone asks, so do the moratoriums apply specifically to the first step of the eviction, or is it, where does it apply? And that's such a good question, which is something that we're going to talk about a little bit more, because it's unclear. And that's for pretty much everyone, to Lauren's point, right? As we are understanding and as we're gaining this information, it's difficult to spread the information about the moratoria updates, right? And that's for service providers, that's for community members to know what their rights are as it relates to the eviction moratoria, as well as landlords, of course, as well are facing those challenges. So some other challenges that we see with the eviction moratoria is that attending court hearings via WebEx, when there's limited internet accessibility. Early on in the pandemic, there were a number of reports that were released that talked about areas that had poor internet access. And so a lot of times, when it comes to attending court hearings, people may have received default judgments simply because they were not able to attend online. Later on, we saw a number of community organizations kind of step in to fill this void by providing computers, internet access, opening up their doors even in the midst of the pandemic where everything was closing down. And so kudos to those community organizations. And I think that's a space, right, for advocacy and continued advocacy to be able to advocate for the tenants' rights to be able to even access the court hearings, right? And then also to Lauren's point, which she talked about a little bit earlier, but attending court hearings without representation, that's another thing that's even more challenging online, because if you're not familiar with your rights, there's already a power dynamic that can make you feel powerless to some degree in these situations. So of course, a amount of stress because of the uncertainty. On a week by week basis, these eviction moratorium deadlines either expired and there were days that were passed. And so families who have, maybe have had an eviction filed against them are standing in the balance beam essentially of if there will be another eviction moratorium or when there will be another eviction moratorium. I recently just reflected on this piece a bit more, especially considering we just experienced this July 31st. It expired and we went some time before the CDC moratorium was extended again. And this is a time where children are preparing to go back to school. I can't imagine what families are facing during this time, having the eviction moratoriums expire while also preparing to maybe put their children back in school, but being uncertain of where that may be if you were evicted, right? So these are ways that we look to, kind of speak to the challenges around the eviction moratorium. And then lastly, to one of the questions point is, no eviction moratorium stopped eviction filings. Eviction filings were still happening during all of this time. What does that mean? So in the report, we talked through this point a bit more, but I would like to share with you all this graphic where we were able to compile some data that reflected eviction filings from January 1st to January 29th. And we were able to see the impact of eviction filings versus actual physical evictions. So like we said, physical evictions were stopped for the most part during this time, unless it was something outside of a rent and possession judgment. And so we can see that eviction filings were continuing throughout this time. This is January of 2019 up until January of 2021. And you can see where there's a significant decrease because of the eviction moratoria that started. And so it's
really more of the court closure itself. Right. So it's like the court closure and the moratoriums, but like really that big dip is just because the court was closed, so nothing could be filed.
Right, exactly. And so at the time of this report, there were over 5,000 evictions filed during the moratoria. And bulk filers did account for the most evictions filed, and the rent and possession filings did decrease, like Lauren said, because courts were actually closed, so they couldn't file, but also we saw those numbers creep back up, and those numbers continue to creep back up.
So Marissa said bulk filer, and I'm not sure that any non-housing attorneys have any idea what that means, but there are, a handful of attorneys who handle the bulk of eviction cases in St. Louis. And as a bulk filer, you get a little bit easier access to filings. During some of the periods, some of the bulk filers actually were assigned to a specific judge or had an extra division almost created to handle their cases. And so this is exists to make the process quicker, the filing process quicker and easier for those large filers. So when we look, if we were to look back, I don't know, Marissa, if you want to go back again to that top line on the previous page, if you can, you can just see that top line, if she goes back, but you can imagine, there it is. So that top red line, like those are not just individual landlords. That is the main attorneys that do this as their primary practice. So there's folks who do this for a living, and that is what the bulk filers generally refer to. You can go back now, sorry about that. So we talked about that whole process and getting to the bottom after the judgment. The final step in most Missouri cases to actually evicting someone is getting a writ of execution. So that's the final step. The sheriff's office carries it out. It can't be like the landlord can't just do it themselves. There's a real process for that. And that step is how courts locally interpreted the CDC moratorium and the other moratoriums. You couldn't do the physical eviction. That's contrary to a lot of the more advocate lawyer readings, or the CDC moratorium said, you can't take any action towards evicting folks. Any action to me certainly seems like filing a lawsuit, but in the end, that is not what the courts came down, and not the guidance that came down even from the CDC. And so it's just this any action, the actual eviction, physical, because that is the part that is the most closely associated with the public health reasoning for the moratorium, because the moratorium was not just we care about what's happening to people who are affected by the pandemic. There's a public health reasoning, and that is why it concentrated at this writ. And so if you look at this graph, the other one had the little dip and then leveling back out, but this one has a little curve and then tanks, absolutely tanks there, starting with the court shutdown, and then doesn't jump back up. And the reason this doesn't jump back up is not because of the court closings, it's because of the eviction moratoria. So you can see that although the filings didn't stop, there was actually a real drop in the execution of eviction judgments. So evictions at this last stage did almost stop. And so when we talk about, there being challenges to the moratoriums, there is also like a real benefit. Like there's a reason to have them, even if they're an imperfect tool. We call them in the report a stopgap, right? Because like we need that. It's not going to carry us forward entirely, but it did do something. And this graph is essentially what it did.
And just to add to that point, Lauren, we talked a bit more about this in our report, but the importance, I think the really significant part about understanding the eviction filings, although the writs requested did decrease, eviction filings are on your record indefinitely to some degree. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but just consider someone who has an eviction filing on their record can still prohibit them, although they were not physically evicted, it can still hinder what their options are in terms of affordable quality housing. Yeah,
I like to say it just as the filing of an eviction case is itself an injury for someone. So that's, even if they are in fact behind for the explicit reasons that the CDC moratorium is designed to help. Let's say you got laid off because you got COVID, and then you're, just some kind of really COVID-y extra related thing, right? And you applied for all the rental assistance, like you could meet everything to a T and still have this eviction injury during the moratorium. So it doesn't prevent this kind of surrounding set of issues. So as Marissa said, I think at the beginning, our report really only went through the end of this January 2021 because we needed to do some data analysis. But Eviction Lab also does some work on eviction filings. And so we were able to pull a graphic from them to kind of show where things have been more recently. And so if you look at the beginning of this graph is back in the beginning of January 2020. So this is 2020 to now. And you have that tank like there were before. You have the leveling off. And if you look at these very last couple of bars, especially the second to last bar, you'll see that there's a big spike at the end of July. And that big spike, I think we can imagine, was in anticipation of the final expiration of the CDC moratorium. Like, all right, we can gear up to actually do these filings because we're going to be allowed to have them. And so you see these upticks at moments where they think that the moratorium is really going to expire. And that's people kind of trying to gauge like when you're going to really be able to take this action. So just for the idea of scale, there were 8,703 eviction filings during the pandemic. So that's during all of this time when we've thought there have been some kind of protections in place. And that's not across the country. That's here in St. Louis City and County. So 5,300 of those were county, and 3,300 were city. So that's kind of what the landscape looks like right now. That doesn't account for any kind of illegal lockouts, any kind of lockouts that happen, or evictions that happen outside of the court process. So landlord just telling you to leave and you leave. That is essentially an eviction, but not counted. Like there's no numbers that grab that. Many illegal lockouts don't get reported, so we can't grab those. So these are just the court numbers, and we know that there are additional numbers outside of the court process as well. So this just kind of gives you an idea of scale. And these are not just 8,000 individuals. These are 8,700 households with kids, with all, you know, the composition of the household is not usually just single people. And so it's not just that number of folks who are affected by this. So in addition to kind of numbers, we also have a question of like, all right, so where are things really happening? We had the county city split, but then when we dig down a little deeper, we can see some other patterns.
Sorry about that. I was trying to unmute. Yes, so one of the things that we wanted to analyze in our report is geographically, where are people located? So many of these zip codes, this is what we found from our research, that many of the same zip codes with higher rates of eviction filings were also hit the hardest during the housing crisis of 2008. Not to mention, these are communities that were historically redlined before the Fair Housing Act passed in 1968. So this data, as we continue to mention, because we understand that there are some limitations with the data time frame, is that the data was as of March 2020 to January 29, 2021. So just to highlight a few of the areas that we see higher rates, higher numbers of eviction per 1,000 people, right, is neighborhoods such as Spanish Lake, 63138, Bell Fountain, 63137, Glasgow Village, 63137, Kinloch, 63140, and Berkeley, 63140. And one thing to make note of is that a lot of these communities listed are primarily communities of color. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when we look at the fair housing overlap. I am sorry if you hear the thunder. I can't apologize for nature. So in addition, we also looked at where evictions are happening today, a little bit more up-to-date information than what we were able to provide in our report. And this is again courtesy of the Eviction Lab. But this goes to show some of the similar areas that we had highlighted also experiencing eviction filings even as of July 4th of 2021. And so while our data stopped at January, this is continuing on to July 4th, and there was very little change as to where higher rates of eviction filings were occurring. So these are similar percentages, and again, where a lot of the communities of color are the zip codes where they have a majority communities of color. And so please remember this map. We'll show a few more maps a little bit later, but I do want to make note of that. So when we look at the fair housing impact, it's important for us to understand what is fair housing first off, right? So fair housing, the Fair Housing Act, sorry about that. The Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. And this was considered to be the last legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. It was during a time of a ton of civil unrest and was actually passed 7 days after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. After sitting in Congress for 2 years. And so the Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination against the protected classes in housing and housing-related activity. This is a federal law that federally protected classes include race, color, religion, sex, national origin, familial status, and disability. One thing to note about that is that at local levels, we have additional protected classes. In some cities or in some states, additional protected classes are things such as immigrant status or domestic violence status, those sort of things. In St. Louis, additional protected classes include sexual orientation and gender identity. And so recently, under the Biden administration, under sex for all civil rights legislation, sex is to be interpreted as, or to include, sexual orientation and gender identity. And that was an executive order that was released in January of this year. One of the things that I'd also like to note is that familial status and disability were added as a protected class at a federal level in 1988, and that was the last time the act was amended. Familial status is speaking to households, families with children 18 years or under. One thing that we see in our report is race and familial status having a lot of, as well as sex, right? Race, sex, and familial status having a lot of intersectionality in terms of who is being impacted by this eviction crisis. And this is why we say that the eviction crisis is a fair housing issue. Yes.
I just wanted to add that although we don't have statistics on disability, anecdotally, a lot of our clients with disabilities are also being highly affected. So it's not something that's been is easy to map for a variety of reasons, but just anecdotally that's also a protected class that's really being affected by this.
Yes, thank you. And then also I wanted to add disparate impact. So the Fair Housing Act, it talks about discrimination in terms of ways that it may be an intent of discrimination, some sort of direct discrimination, but sometimes it has an effect, a discriminatory effect. And that's where we look at disparate impact, where a seemingly neutral policy has a disproportionate impact on people that belong within a protected class in comparison to others. And when we look at this map, again, we have more maps available in our report. If you'd like to have access to our full report, we can share that with you as well. But for one protected class that we're going to highlight is race. So 3 of the protected classes that have experienced a disproportionate impact of the eviction crisis includes race, specifically people of color, families with children, and female heads of households. So we were able to see the overlap with the series of maps that we produced. And as you can see, a lot of the zip codes that were highlighted previously are also areas where there are predominantly people of color. So from 3% to 100%. And again, you can take a look at our reports to look a little bit deeper in those statistics. I'm sorry. So moving forward, some of the calls to action that we had as a result of this report.
Yeah, so it was, I mean, this is not a happy story for the most part. And when we start looking at a wider lens on long-term access to housing, that disparate impact piece becomes even more substantial. So it's not just the eviction, right? It's the injury that filing causes. It's the ability to access housing down the road. And so when the further out we pan, the more we can see that this is a fair housing issue that's going to be affecting communities of color, families with children for a long time. And Marissa mentioned school, like all of these other pieces that are connected to housing, voting. And so EHOC thinks we should probably all try to do something about this. And it's not something that, we should only have more CDC moratoriums there, but that is one of the things that we still think we need at this point. But we need them at the local level, where it's clear to the courts, it's clear to the attorneys, it's clear to the tenants what the rules are, what the time periods are, and how we're going to keep families in their homes. So not like extending them for long enough, having people aware of what's going on, and continuing these moratoriums as we continue to experience a surge in COVID cases as we want to be winding down, but are not in fact winding down the pandemic. So taking away the tools when the problem is still there is definitely not what we're calling for. So we call for more moratoriums or extension of local moratoriums. And I think maybe this is a highly social work audience. And so you all may be aware about how difficult it has been to get out some of this rental assistance money. We definitely need it. And rental assistance needs to be available for people, because just having legal representation or just having better access to the courts, a computer access, but you still can't pay your rent, isn't going to solve the problem. And so these are multi-pronged things where you also need to have access to funds and access to counsel and time from a moratorium. So all of these pieces are almost like legs of the stool to make this work. And so eviction defense right to counsel, that's, attorneys, can't help themselves but want to, no, I'm kidding. We think that to navigate the system and to know what your remedies are, to know what you can file, to know when a notice was improper, you need to have a right to counsel and access to counsel, because there are some even very simple procedural defenses that people have that without some legal knowledge you wouldn't know. And so being able to put forward a legal defense and also hook somebody up with rental assistance for back rent at the same time can in fact keep somebody in their home even without a moratorium. It can make everybody whole. So that's an immediate still triage stopgap, but on a broader level, it was really hard to put our report together. There is not a lot of public transparency about what's going on, what filings are happening, what executions are happening. It's currently we've had to do a lot of manual data gathering from the Missouri courts CaseNet system, and trying to gather information from the sheriff's department, these kinds of things, but it's been very difficult. And so we think that just being able to access data, for there to be more transparency and more data access, is something that would allow both data-driven policy solutions that would allow us to understand really the nature of the problem and be able to tailor responses. We also talked about this idea of the filing itself being an injury. And so we call for some kind of protection for tenants with eviction records, especially during the pandemic period where there's just a lot of evictions happening because people cannot control the economic environment and the public health environment right now. So right now you could look somebody up for the most part on the CaseNet system and find out if they had an eviction filing. Even if the case had been dismissed, that's going to pop up if your landlord or property manager runs your credit or runs some other kind of sorry, there's a question in the comments, Marissa, if you want to help me process that one. So even having that that filing is an injury. So one of the things we call for, and something that's happening in the county, at least to some degree, is sealing those records so that they aren't just publicly available. So I know that seems in contrast to data transparency, but we don't want data transparency for each individual named person. That's anonymous data. But when it comes down to individual records, we want to keep that out of the public sphere so that it doesn't keep popping up for people for the rest of their lives. And then finally, our landlord tenant laws in Missouri are built for the landlord. I as an advocate, I feel very confident in saying that. And so there's a reason to advocate for a tenant bill of rights and other tools like that shift some of that power away from the landlord side and give tenants more rights.
Yes. So we do just have one more slide, and then we'll get to the questions in the chat. Thank you all for going ahead and populating those. I see that we have about 10 more minutes left, but we just wanted to give, ways to get involved. A lot of times people were looking for ways to assist us or assist the work that's being done around this eviction crisis. And so, as Lauren mentioned, Homes for All is a coalition that is working to pull together a tenant bill of rights. And so they have been hosting tenant bill of rights listening sessions. You can follow their social media accounts for upcoming dates. I believe they have one this Thursday happening, a tenant bill of rights listening session to determine what things should be a part of the bill and what other ways should tenants be protected. I know in Kansas City, they recently passed a tenant bill of rights for their tenants. And so we're hoping to get some of the similar impacts with our own. And then also they have a hotline that assists tenants facing challenges, as well as EHOC also has a hotline for our landlord tenant line, as well as discrimination line and our eviction defense program. We are also hosting a rental assistance application event on August 20th and 21st from 10 a.m. until 6 p.m. on the 20th, and then Saturday, August 21st from 10 a.m. until 2 p.m. Now, finally, how anyone can get involved is by holding elected officials accountable, attending the city council or county council meetings that are deciding how we are affecting affordable housing, the housing landscape as a whole, whether that's a HUD's zoning meeting or a general council meeting, voicing your concerns with housing accessibility. Alrighty. And at this time, we will go ahead and move forward with questions. Thank you so much, Janet. I see that we have a few more questions.
Great. Yeah, there are some wonderful questions in the chat. And first, I recognize how hard it must have been to compile those really, really sobering statistics, especially when it sounds like data transparency was not on your side. But thank you for making that clear, and thank you for sharing the process with that. Yeah, so there's some really good questions, and Tiffany and I have got a few, but I do want to elevate what we have here. Kayla is wondering if it's legal for debt collectors, law firms, to add additional charges to a judgment after they've already come up with the execution. She's saying she has several clients who've attempted to start payment plans and then informed of additional charges that weren't on their official judgments. I don't know if you have enough details to comment, but that seems like a specific situation where you might have expertise for.
Yeah, there obviously would be questions I would have to ask for each individual situation, like with the legality of it. But in general, the judgment is what is written on the piece of paper is the judgment. So these additional fees don't necessarily become part of the judgment, but that doesn't mean they can't be applied if the person is planning to keep living there. And the judgment doesn't mean you don't start accruing rent. It's not a good practice, and I can see, like, it might be something that you would want to bring to an attorney to actually look at the documents. Like, what are these charges? Are they charges that are based in the lease in some way? Because there's, a lot of leases have sneaky things about how you can start charging people extra things, and so it's really important to look to the documents that people have. Because some of them are really different. Okay, years after they have to leave. So that would not mean that those wouldn't become part of the judgment if they're trying to satisfy the judgment, or if they're having garnishment towards satisfying the judgment. Like, those extra charges would have to be kind of additionally approved by the court to become part of the judgment that they're trying to satisfy. So beyond that, we'd have to dig into the details, but that's kind of the judgment number is what's on that paper, and then these other things may be applied, but they are not part of that judgment.
I had a quick question. And first off, thank you so much. This has been very enlightening. I knew just a little bit, mostly through friends that have gone through different processes, but it's always good to have this deeper dive. I guess when I was thinking about the idea of being able to advance protections for people, I feel like I wanted to know if you thought that stigma about having to need this help would actually prevent people from being able to have laws passed. Because I feel like a lot of times when we talk about poverty or people needing help, sometimes people assign judgments and like it's a moral failure for you to be able to need this job, excuse me, not job, but to need this help because the only reason you're in this situation is because of some bad decision you've made. And I wonder how much that might complicate what you're trying to do.
That's a really good question. And one thing, you know, it is a stigma that people encounter all of the time, right? One thing that we did notice though is that as a result of the pandemic, these people that were impacted by the eviction crisis are people that have had higher incomes and so have not traditionally even received rental assistance in the past. And so that is a very valid point that you make, because yes, you know, reaching out for that assistance could feel different if you're not even comfortable using those systems. And so we try that, you know, part of the reason we're hosting this event is to try to make it more accessible to people, because it has not been an easy process to get it directly to who needs it for a number of reasons. And so, Lauren, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons we're advocating so strongly for local action at the St. Louis County and St. Louis City level is we know that at the state level, we're going to encounter a significant amount of, I am being gentle, significant amount of that you shouldn't need these resources, bootstrap, et cetera, right? And so what we're hoping is that we can do that, not just us, but that people who are interested in housing, Housing Defense Collective, all these different folks can organize on a local level and start making changes through that kind of organizing and advocacy, and take apart some of that stigma, and knowing that we need to aim close to home.
So I'm going to ask a question that may ask you to speculate a little bit, and if you're not comfortable, you can please say so. But I was really struck by how the number of filings just exploded in anticipation of the moratorium being over. And it has me wondering and concerned whether the number of people that are impacted, whether, you know, this data of what's actually officially already happened may be the tip of the iceberg, that there's a lot of people who haven't even enacted first steps because the moratorium persuaded them not to. And I'm just wondering if there's anything you want to say about whether these numbers are likely reflective of the scope of the problem or only a part of it.
I think that question, and it is speculative a bit, but it is definitely dependent on how quickly people have access to rental assistance in terms of what it could look like afterwards. I think that's one major variable that we have to take into account. And as things are changing, like right now, I believe the city has actually made it possible for people to directly apply to the Treasury Department for funding versus going through their landlord's approval, which has been a point of contention in the past. So things like that changing can impact. Like we said, in some cases, if people receive the money for the back rent that they owed and are able to now, you know, get back on their feet, then maybe they won't face an eviction after the eviction moratoria expired. But it is safe to, when we look at the map on a larger scale in terms of where these eviction pilots have already taken place, I think personally, I think that it's safe to assume that those numbers will only increase, as we've already seen spikes in places where eviction moratoria were already expired.
I had one quick question about sealing evictions. I saw that as something that you suggested to be able to protect people as they go forward and they're able to pull themselves out of a particular housing crisis. In order for that to be effective, can that be a local thing, or does that need to be federal action? Would it protect people against state lines?
It's, you know, I don't have 100% I am not 100% sure, but it's the order raising the security level is a local court order. So the judge on the case, like I could petition the judge to raise the security level to 3 or 5, and that would make the security level on that case that security level permanently. And so
And then if I moved to Maryland, no one would be it.
And it should not, I don't know the details enough about all of the different search and, you know, all of the different screeners. Like, I bet there's ways to work around it and try to dig it up. But in theory, it should be that like that someone in Maryland can't search Missouri courts and find it any more than somebody in Missouri could search Missouri courts and find it. But, you know, of these, there's a lot of sophisticated screening types of programs out there. And so I can't speak to how well it's going to be hidden, but they're like the highest security level, like this number 5 that the county is using. You can't find it unless you know the case number or if you're the attorney on the case. So it's a pretty extensive, but it at least gives people a chance.
One thing to add to that too, Lauren, is we ask for public transparency with data, but to note that is disaggregated data. That is not data that is tying to the individual household, simply data that can be analyzed for issues such as fair housing issues, whether it's because of one of the protected classes or where they're occurring geographically, but not to, you know, tie it to the individual household.
That's such an important distinction to draw. So we have made an hour disappear so very quickly. So much good content shared. Really appreciate that. I really also appreciate the engagement of the audience as they've weighed in with what they know and what they're seeing out in the field. Before we go, I just wanted to offer Lauren and Marissa an opportunity to send us out with any closing thought or call to action, just anything that you want to leave the audience with as the last thing in their mind.
I'm actually going to choose to use my moment to respond to a comment that I just noticed, the difference between fair housing and affordable housing and equitable housing, and that all of these issues are tied together. But fair housing is very specifically about protected classes. It is about families with children. It is about race. It is about national origin. It's about religion. It's about disability, female heads of household, these kinds of things. And so we're looking at, you know, when we think about this housing crisis, we know it's a housing crisis in all of these ways, that affordability is hard to find somewhere to move right now. If you've got to move, it's so expensive. So all of these things are tied together. Affordable housing is really about dollars and cents, but fair housing is non-discriminatory, equal access, not, you know, having policies that are hammering folks in these protected classes. And so it's a very, you know, our angle is very much like, not only is this a housing crisis, this is a housing crisis for people that we care about in a special way. And so that's my little closer, is just like, this is having a discriminatory effect, and let's not forget it.
Yeah. And one last thing is just, you know, if you haven't already, dig into our report. Go ahead and dig into our report. It is available on our website. And we can also send it out if you'd like us to, as a link. And also, if you can volunteer for our rental assistance event that is coming up, please do, or share with your clients. Share with your clients so that they can also attend. We want to be a part of the solution in making rental assistance more accessible to people. Thank you.
That's wonderful, Marissa. We do have some people that are asking for that link. So what I'd like to do is, if you will send it to me, we'll post it on the part of the Open Classroom website. We have one that's for resources. Anything that presenters promise, that gives us a place to drop it where everybody should be able to locate it. And we're certainly happy to share out this really, really important work that you all have done. So thank you so much for being with us. Thank you to the audience. Tiffany, thank you so much for helping things roll smoothly. Please stay healthy and safe out there, everybody, and we will hope to see you again very soon at another Open Classroom. Goodbye now.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.